Is this culinary genius or just edible propaganda? This is macon, bacon made from mutton. And if you haven't heard of it, then let me introduce you to one of Britain's weirdest wartime breakfast foods. During World War II, with pork in short supply and the Luftwaffe out in force, Britain's kitchens came up with a wartime miracle that no one asked for: mutton bacon, or as they dubbed it, macon, and had some very famous fans. Even George Orwell, best known for combining totalitarian nightmares with farm animals, wrote down a recipe in his wartime diary because apparently Animal Farm wasn't bleak enough. So this week on my quest to see what food from history tastes like, I'm going to be making some home-cured mutton bacon to find out what it tastes like, and I'll be serving it up with some other World War II breakfast staples including powdered scrambled egg and a state bread recipe that the British called Hitler's secret weapon. On the 23rd of January 1940, George Orwell presumably took a break from doublespeak to copy a recipe from a newspaper into his private diary, and he tells you to choose a large fresh leg of mutton, or a shoulder. I've gone for mutton belly instead, as I wanted to have an easy comparison with the pork bacon we're all more familiar with. So I have a 1 kilo joint of mutton belly. First up, I'm using a sharp knife, scoring along the bones to remove them, because the only thing likely to make this dish sound less appealing is bony bacon. Once your bacon is boneless, the recipe continues: salt it with a preparation comprising 450 grams of common salt, 150 grams of moist sugar, and 30 grams of saltpeter. Now, saltpeter is often used in curing meat to help the preservation and to develop colour. George Orwell's recipe tells us to use 30 grams of the stuff, which has me a bit concerned, where the recommended guidance is not to exceed half a gram per kilo of meat, as I have. I feel that George Orwell was trying to create his own dystopia again. Into our salt and our sugar goes a half gram of saltpeter. As this sheep is too big for my biggest dish, I'm dividing it into 2 for ease. Georgie Boy tells you to rub this well into the flesh, taking sure that no part escapes the salting, and then place it in a deep dish and repeat the process every day for a fortnight. At the end, Orwell tells us to drain away any moisture and hang it up for a week, which I'm going to do with the addition of rinsing before leaving it so that the skin can dry to form a pellicle, which is a tacky protein layer that forms on bacon after drying. This helps the smoke stick better, it keeps the fat from spoiling on the surface, and it locks in moisture so that the bacon doesn't turn into jerky. So once it's finished drying, it's time to bust out the smoker like a true basic Brit. George's guidance for smoking is a far cry from the scientific approach that many take today. He doesn't give any guidance on timings or temperatures, he just offers some pretty creative solutions for smoking, which includes using a sawdust-filled cask with a red-hot iron inside to generate the smoke. Number 2 was hanging it over a chimney over a fire made from damp firewood for a week. Or number 3, hanging it above an underground fire that you built in your shed. I'm not looking to burn down my shed right now, so I'm sticking a probe into the mutton belly and putting it into a pellet smoker at about 80 degrees. And then leaving it for 2 to 3 hours until the internal temperature reaches 66 degrees. Once rested, I'm slicing it into little sheepy rashers and frying them in a pan until lightly crispy. Although it's pretty obscure now, cured mutton has been knocking around for ages, with its roots most likely in Scotland, where the landscape favoured sheep over pigs, hills, heather, general pig unfriendliness. And believe it or not, mutton used to be the sheep meat of choice in Britain and most of Europe. None of your spring lamb. We're talking peak popularity from medieval times through to the 18th century. Why? Well, sheep were basically walking wool dispensers. You didn't eat the young ones. You waited until they'd paid their rent in fleece, and then they became dinner. And aristocrats loved mutton. Rich, fatty, slow-roasted cuts of mutton were the medieval version of dry-aged Wagyu. It was hearty, it was practical. Around 1730, cookbooks suddenly started filling up with recipes that treated sheep like undercover pigs, curing their backs like bacon and their legs like ham. But odds are this wasn't some hot new food trend. More likely it was just the moment when an old rural habit finally made it into print. But by the 19th century, mutton was starting to lose its crown. Urban life was on the rise, and people wanted tender, quick cooking meat. Enter lamb. Smaller, softer, and ready in half the time. Then came World War II. Rationing turned mutton into an accidental national staple, and it wasn't until the drum beats of World War II started that mutton bacon got a serious push into commercial production. The logic was simple. Sheep eat grass, and pigs need lots of space and eat imported feed, and Britain needed every calorie it could grow on its own turf. Meanwhile, mutton was loitering about like some sheep equivalent of the Home Guard, past their woolly prime but still ready for action. The message was clear. Mutton was the patriotic meat of choice. But the war effort escalated so quickly that in 1943 even mutton had to be rationed. Then post-war, macon eventually sizzled out after rationing ended in 1954. But here's the problem, mutton was tough. Like really, really tough. A whole generation came out of the war associating mutton with sad stews and school dinners that smelled faintly like wet wool. Supermarkets boomed, more tender lamb joints became the default, and butchers quietly stopped selling mutton. Mutton may have not tasted quite right, but it helped a nation get through the darkest of breakfasts. So yeah, maybe it's time to give mutton another go. And on that note, although I'm curious to try mutton bacon, I wanted to do something a bit more exciting than just frying slices of bacon on their own. So I thought, let's go full World War II by having it with powdered scrambled eggs. During World War II, fresh eggs practically vanished from British kitchens, thanks to strict rationing and German blockades cutting off imports. But America started shipping powdered egg across the Atlantic, and the Ministry of Food pushed dried reconstituted eggs as the wartime breakfast hero. In fact, so many kids were raised on powdered egg that when eggs finally returned after rationing ended, many kids reportedly just turned their noses up at the real deal because they'd become so used to powdered egg. And you simply make it by adding 1 part of powdered egg to a bowl and mixing it with 2 parts of water, then whisking. I'm going to use my ration coupon to melt some butter in a pan before adding the reconstituted egg and cooking to something that actually resembles scrambled egg, to be fair. And I'm also going to have some toast, courtesy of National Loaf. During World War II, Britain banned white bread and introduced the National Loaf, which was a joyless, grey hunk of wholemeal designed to stretch wheat supplies and keep people marginally more alive. It was beloved only by nutritionists and possibly dentists. According to a recipe from the World War II Ministry of Food, you make National Loaf by, in a large bowl, mixing together 340 grams of wholemeal bread flour, 3/4 of a tablespoon of salt, and 3/4 of a tablespoon of dried yeast. Stir in 1 teaspoon of honey or treacle, and then add 225 ml of tepid water. The recipe then tells you to combine the mix into a rough dough, then knead on a clean surface for about 10 minutes, all until you have a soft dough. I'm also baking this the day before eating it because, by law, you couldn't buy National Loaf fresh. It had to go slightly stale first. Why? Because stale bread slices thinner, and in wartime Britain, even sandwiches had to be strategic. As sensible a strategy as this was, here it's left me with a dough that has no more elasticity than when I started kneading it 10 minutes ago. Which kind of plays out as you'd expect when we are told to transfer the dough to a lightly oiled bowl, cover with a tea towel, and let it rise in a warm place for up to 2 hours. At which point we are greeted with a dough that is barely changed. So we keep calm, carry on, try again. Sticking to the same recipe but with slightly fresher yeast and warmer water at 38 degrees. Mix, knead, and leave to rise again, and 2 hours later, we're left with pretty much the same outcome. And get our first taste of why Brits called this bread Hitler's secret weapon. The recipe tells you to knock the dough back, which feels pretty redundant as there are virtually no pockets of air in this to knock back out. But in any case, we're shaping it and placing it into a loaf tin, and then baking for 30 minutes at 200 degrees until you have a block of wartime bread. And after leaving it for a day to go stale, it's time to cut off a couple of slices and toast them, and laying the toast down next to our scrambled egg and adding our mutton bacon. Time to taste. I'm going to tackle this in the order that I'm least excited about. I'm least excited about trying the National Loaf, which as far as bread goes just looks like sadness personified, but stodgy and unsatisfying. It's still going. It's kind of turning to clay in my mouth. Need a drink of water after that. I was going to say that it's probably okay if you can cover it in salty butter, and then I remembered butter was heavily rationed, so probably wouldn't be an option. Powdered egg though! In the pan it actually looked okay. A little bit solid, but let's see. The flavour is there, the texture is not. It's a little bit like scrambled egg and mashed potato had a night of meaningless passion together. If I was raised on it, I could understand the appeal. The day I start a prepper bunker, I'm going to load it up with that. Now we come to the main event, mutton bacon. Oh,
That is a really bizarre flavour.
The first flavour notes you get are pure bacon as we know it. Salty, crispy, slightly chewy. And then right before you're convinced that you're actually eating real pork bacon, it springs a roast dinner on you. And it's a bit strange. If you love lamb and you love a bit of barnyard funk, then I'd actually really recommend it. As interesting and tasty as this is, I can safely say that this bacon hasn't aged as well as mutton does.